On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to continue our study in John's Gospel, chapter 18, the trial of the righteous Tzaddik. Kirsten is here to discuss with me what happened after Jesus was arrested.
And JR, to review slightly, we're looking at the 18th chapter of John. We've now come to the trial of Jesus. We have discussed his arrest. We've discussed the fact that the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John is built around the idea of righteousness, specifically the righteous man. And Jesus, of course, typifies the ultimate righteous man. And now that righteous man has been taken into, I guess, the most infamous trial in the history of humanity.
He's taken to the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. And Annas, of course, was the first one to receive him. Now, Annas was the high priest for 3 years during Jesus' ministry. Only in the last year was Caiaphas appointed as the high priest. Well, of course, Caiaphas was the son-in-law. He had married the boss's daughter. Evidently, Annas didn't have a son, so he wanted his son-in-law to take over as high priest. He must have been getting up in years. But why was Annas the first one to receive Christ? I think because he was the one who, for 3 years, had plotted the death of Jesus. And obviously then, since he was the brains behind all this, he was the first one to receive Jesus.
And we know that Jesus made it plain when he offered himself to the people. JR, he made it very plain that he was coming as king. He fulfilled the messianic signs, including the healing of the man blind from birth, including the healing of the man possessed with the dumb demon who was self-destructive, mute, couldn't speak, couldn't use his brain. Jesus had also cleansed the leper. And JR, all these signs were said to be signs of the Messiah. He did every one of them, and Annas knew about that, and Annas nevertheless plotted against him.
So get the timing here, please. Around midnight, they left the upper room, went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. It took him a little while to get there. He prayed in agony 3 times. We think, an hour at a time. We don't know for sure. But it's somewhere after 3 a.m. now when they come to get Jesus. They arrest him. Judas Iscariot kisses him. And by the way, this is typical of a greeting in the Middle East. So this is not some homosexual thing.
No.
But it was just a greeting. Even to this very day in the Middle East, instead of shaking hands, they kiss on the cheeks, on each cheek. And so Jesus was arrested, and it took them at least a half hour, maybe 45 minutes, to get them back over across the Kedron Valley, over to the west of the temple grounds, to the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. And John went inside the palace himself, and it's kind of interesting to me, Gary. It says that John went in, verse 15, because he was known to the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. Now, what is this strange statement here? John was known to the high priest.
And by the way, Peter followed at a little bit of a distance, but when I think of Peter and John, I sort of think of fellow laborers.
Yes.
A couple of fishermen.
Yes.
But this sets them apart. John was in some way, in some inner circle, and the Bible doesn't help us much.
Yes. Now, we know that John writes meticulously about the liturgy of the temple, both in his gospel and in the book of Revelation. So he knew all about the temple priesthood. I don't know, maybe he went to a yeshiva of priests when he was a child. Maybe he and Caiaphas were buddies together as children. It's possible that Caiaphas went fishing with John when they were kids. We don't know for sure. We can only speculate, but we know this, that there was an intimacy there that allowed John to go into the palace of the high priest. He was admitted without fear, even though I'm sure Caiaphas knew that John was a disciple of Jesus, perhaps even a part of the inner circle of Peter, James, and John. And yet, this didn't bother Caiaphas.
They must have been good friends. In some way, they were very good friends. Meanwhile, Peter stays outside, and he gathers with others around a fire that's been built. A little bit chilly that evening, and you know what happens when somebody builds a fire? Everybody comes together. I can just visualize this.
Yes. Now, this was early spring, and early in the morning, it's cold. It got really cold. By the way, Jerusalem is up above sea level. It's in the top of a mountain, and so it was chilly.
Right.
And they built the fire. By the way, one other note. Do you remember James was the first? James, the brother of John, was the first martyr.
Yes.
So it's possible that James had a false sense of security because John knew the high priest. So maybe he was not really thinking about his life being that much in danger. And so that's one reason why maybe he was such easy prey for Herod.
And somebody else who wasn't thinking, that was Peter. Peter was reacting. He was not thinking. And we come then to one of the most famous episodes in all the Bible, and that's Peter's reaction to the people around him.
So here's Peter outside the palace. John goes inside. A few minutes later, John comes and speaks to the girl at the door that keeps the door. And he whispers to her, and then he motions to Peter to come. So evidently he obtained permission for Peter to enter. And so as Peter goes in, he finds this fire, goes over to warm himself, and she speaks up. She who kept the door says, "Hey, aren't you one of this man's disciples?" And of course Peter wanted to keep his anonymity, and this was only the first time he denied the Lord. He may not have thought much about it. He certainly wasn't going to deny him 3 times, but he thought, I'm in a den of lions here. I think I'd better be incognito. And so he just said, not me, and went on over to the fire. But it didn't take long until somebody else there at the fire said, "You're one of his disciples, aren't you?" "Oh, no, not me. No, I don't know the man." But then, about a half hour later, Gary, a relative of Malchus, the servant of the high priest whose ear Peter had cut off just a few hours before, this relative of Malchus, maybe a cousin, maybe a brother, was also in the garden. He spoke up. He was sitting around the fire, warming himself as well, while Jesus was over here answering these ungodly questions by the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas. And this relative of Malchus, this is the 3rd time, says, "Didn't I see you in the garden?" And this is where Peter angrily denied. And no sooner had the sound got out of his mouth than Jesus turned and looked at him. Oh, that was the 3rd denial.
And J.R., while all this was going on, that Jesus is being questioned. Here in Matthew 18:19, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. So, what did you teach? What was your doctrine? Well, Jesus answered, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught the synagogue and the temple whither the Jews always resort, and in secret I've said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And you know, the priest could have asked witnesses to come in at that point. John was there. He could have put John on the stand, so to speak. By this time, Peter had been exposed. He could have put Peter on the stand. But you know, he never did that. He never brought witnesses. That's amazing.
Yes, in Matthew's gospel, 2 false witnesses come in and they say, well, this man claimed that he could destroy the temple and raise it again in 3 days. And then another said he claimed to be, I think, the Son of God. Anyway, the high priest says, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus, by the way, had not answered these 2 witnesses, which, by the way, is remarkable because in the Mosaic law it required 2 witnesses to condemn a man.
That's correct. And they called, instead of 2 true witnesses, 2 false witnesses.
Aha, yes. Well, Jesus then hears the high priest say, "I demand in the name of the living God that you tell me, are you the Messiah?" Well, when he invoked the living God, Jesus had to answer him, didn't he?
He
Since
did.
He was the living God.
and he just said these words. He said, "You said it."
Yep. You said it. And one of these days, Jesus said, "You're going to see me sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of glory." Whoa, the high priest ripped his shirt off. He was so angry. He said, "We don't need any more witnesses. We've got him. He's committed blasphemy." And all the Sanhedrin said, "He's guilty of death." Well, there's more. We'll be back in just a moment. Jesus has been condemned by the Sanhedrin court. Peter has denied the Lord for the third time. Here's the cock crow. Turns to look at Jesus. Jesus turns and looks at him. The piercing eyes of Jesus went right into the soul of Peter. And the Bible says Peter went out and wept bitterly. He realized that Jesus knew meticulously exactly what was going to happen, and Peter fell prey to that. There was not much he could do about it. Jesus knew the future, didn't he?
He did. And by the way, let me just say that we shouldn't be too condemning of Peter. I don't think there's a man alive who hasn't, at a certain time in public, withheld his testimony of Jesus in order not to be thought of as intrusive.
Yes.
If you know what I mean. We're all just a little bit reluctant, a little reticent, particularly in an accusatory crowd, to bear witness of Jesus. And I think Peter's episode's put in the Bible for us to kind of encourage us, you know. Don't fall back, don't falter. Speak up when you have the opportunity to do so. And J.R., what happens at this time in John 18:28? They then led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. Now, this hall of judgment is the Gentile hall of judgment. It is specifically a Roman place. And by the way, the Jews who wanted to maintain good standing didn't follow, because to do so would have defiled them.
You know, this was probably in the fortress of Antonia. This is where Pilate was staying during these holidays. He normally lived up in Caesarea on the coast of the Mediterranean, just about 9 miles south of Haifa and Mount Carmel. So he was there for the holidays to make sure that there were no riots, because there were 1 million people or more there. And so Pilate was wakened and told that they were bringing a prisoner to him. And so he went out and he asked them, "What accusation bring ye against this man?" So before interrogating Jesus much further, he went out and asked about what's wrong. You know, why are you accusing him? And they answered and said to him, "If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee." In other words, you don't need to know what it was that we condemned him of. Just we brought it to you for sentencing, for execution. They were not allowed under Roman law to execute. Now, I don't know how this fits with Stephen later in the book of Acts when he was stoned. I don't know if they did that in defiance of Roman law, but they wanted to do everything by the book, evidently. They brought him to Pilate, and surely the Romans were in Jerusalem at that time, so the Jews could not have gotten away with trying to stone him.
And they call him a malefactor here in verse 30. Now, let me just put that in modern English. That's the word criminal. That's what we don't call people malefactors today. We say so-and-so has been convicted and he is a criminal. So in the minds of the Jews, Jesus was a criminal. And it was in that position that he was brought before Pilate as a criminal already convicted.
Yes, and they wanted execution. But according to verse 31, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of the Jews, of Jesus, might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. In fact, it is David in Psalm 22 who describes crucifixion. And it is Zacharias who describes the wounds in his hands.
Yes.
And the method of crucifixion. So Jesus wants to make sure that the prophecies of the Old Testament are meticulously fulfilled. He saw to it that they were, every single one of them, that there might be no doubt whatsoever that Jesus was the promised Messiah.
J.R., I think it's fascinating that the very first question we have out of the mouth of Pilate, verse 33, art thou the King of the Jews? He just puts that question straight at Jesus, and it's fascinating that this is the question that he would come up with. He could have asked a dozen different questions, but no, he says, are you the King of the Jews? That's interesting.
Now, I think that just before he enters this judgment hall again, he sends him to Herod. We're told in the other Gospels that Herod was down from Galilee, that Herod lived in Tiberias. And so since Jesus... he found out that Jesus was from Galilee. He thought, I'll get out of this. I'll weasel out of this. He sent him over to Herod. And that's Herod's jurisdiction. Well, when Jesus went to Herod, Jesus wouldn't say a word. Herod, frustrated, had a gorgeous royal robe put upon him and sent him back. I don't know if it was one of his own robes or not, but I think this is the reason why when Pilate entered the judgment hall again, he saw Jesus with this royal robe of the king. And he says, art thou the King of the Jews? So I think that's what prompted it here. Jesus answered him saying, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Even thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? And this is where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from thence. Pilate therefore saith unto him, art thou a king then? He wants to know, are you a king? Since he said, my kingdom is not of this world, aha, then you are a king? Jesus answered, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Gary, I think Jesus was saying here, I am a king.
Exactly.
And for this reason, Pilate put the inscription over his cross, King of the Jews.
In fact, what Jesus was doing was clarifying his position to those who have ears to hear.
Yes.
He was saying, my kingdom is not of this world. In other words, my kingdom is not of this Greco-Roman, Judean political structure. He says, oh no, I didn't come to rule over you people. When my rule comes, it's not of this world. It's going to be the Father's world, and it'll be an entirely different world. And that's essentially, he was clarifying who he really was.
Yes, and isn't it interesting that he said to Caiaphas, one of these days you will see me coming in the power and glory of the kingdom, in clouds of glory.
Clouds of glory.
Well, how's he going to do that? He died. In fact, we have the coffin that Caiaphas' bones were buried in. It's in a museum in Jerusalem to this day. They found it a few years ago, the tomb of Caiaphas. Has his name written across it. So how's he going to see Jesus coming? Well, you know, he will. He will. The rich man in the story of the rich man and Lazarus died and went to hell and was burning in the flames. And he could see Abraham. So they are not out of existence. They still exist somewhere. And he's going to see all this. He knows today that Jesus was the Messiah and is the Messiah. And I think Caiaphas is very much alive somewhere today beyond this realm of existence. But he knows. He knows.
And I'll tell you something, J.R. The one thing that's fascinating to me, Jesus concluded that remark by saying, every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, what is truth?
Yeah.
And the truth was standing right before him in human form. Yeah. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Pilate says, what is truth? Maybe the greatest question ever asked.
And I think maybe he was implying there that truth is what the victor makes it to be.
Indeed.
You know, the one
Yes.
who wins. And he went out then and said to those members of the Sanhedrin, I've got a deal for you. I've got Barabbas here, who's a crook. I have Jesus here, who's the King of the Jews. Now, who do you want me to release? For it's a custom that I release one. Well, they cried for Barabbas to be released. And this shocked Pilate. I guess it sort of made him afraid, because his own wife had said to him, sent a note to him, have nothing to do with this just man. I have suffered because of him. Well, it's a fascinating study. John chapter 18. We'll be back in just a moment.